Welcome to Infinite History Stories. There is a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You know the one. You have given everything you had, you did what was right, you stood when others ran, and then one morning you woke up and the fire was gone, not your faith. Exactly. Something harder to name than that. The feeling that you have nothing left to give and no one to tell. Tonight we follow a man who felt exactly that. He stood alone before a king. He called fire from heaven. He outran horses in a storm. And then he sat down under a small desert tree and asked God to let him die. His name is Elijah. And before this night is over, you will understand why the angel did not give him a sermon. The angel gave him bread. Settle in. Close your eyes. The fire is about to fall, but that is not the end of the story. Chapter 1. The Man Before the Fire. Every story has a beginning the writer chooses carefully. The beginning tells you everything about what kind of story you are about to hear. The Gospel of Mark begins with a man walking out of the desert. Matthew begins with a long genealogy tracing a family line across 42 generations. Luke begins like a historian, carefully noting his sources, writing to a patron named Theophilus. And then there is the story of Elijah. Elijah begins with no genealogy, no childhood, no introduction from the narrator explaining who this man is, where he came from, or how he was trained. He simply appears, fully formed, already burning, already speaking. The first time Elijah opens his mouth in the biblical record, he is standing before Ahab, the king of Israel, and he is saying something that no reasonable person would say to the most powerful man in the country. He is announcing a drought. Before we understand why that was extraordinary, we need to understand who Ahab was and what Israel had become. Because the world Elijah stepped into was not simply a world that had drifted from God. It was a world that had made a deliberate, systematic, and politically calculated decision to replace God with something more convenient. Ahab was the seventh king of the northern kingdom of Israel. He ruled for 22 years, and the biblical account of his reign uses language that appears nowhere else in the records of the kings. It says that Ahab did more evil in the sight of Yahweh than all who were before him. That is a remarkable statement. Cause the kings before him were not good men. To be worse than all of them required genuine effort. His marriage to Jezebel was the hinge point. Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and she came from a culture in which Baal worship was not simply a religious practice, but the organizing principle of public life. Baal was the storm god, the god of rain and fertility, the god who made crops grow and rivers run and land produce. In an agricultural society, Baal was not a peripheral figure. He was the center of everything that mattered for survival. When Jezebel married Ahab, she did not quietly adapt to the religious culture of her new home. She brought her gods with her. She funded the construction of a temple to Baal in the capital city of Samaria. She installed 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asher, and gave them seats at the royal table. She began systematically killing the prophets of Yahweh, hunting them down the way you would hunt down the agents of a foreign power. This was not syncretism where two religious systems blend together uncomfortably. This was replacement, a deliberate cultural and spiritual project designed to remove Yahweh from the center of Israelite identity and install Baal in his place. And for the most part, it was working into this world. With no introduction and no warning walks a man named Elijah. Let us begin with his name. Because in the Hebrew tradition, a name is never simply a label. A name is the first declaration a being makes about itself before it has done anything at all. The name Elijah comes from two Hebrew roots pressed together. The first is Eli, which means my God. The second is Yahu, which is a shortened form of Yahweh, the personal name of the God of Israel. Put them together. My God is Yahweh. In a world where Ahab had built a temple to Baal, in a world where Jezebel had installed hundreds of Baal's prophets at the royal table, in a world where the official state religion was systematically replacing the God of Israel, a man walks in whose very name is a counter-declaration, my God is Yahweh. Before Elijah speaks a single word, his name has already answered the central question of his entire life. Now, where did he come from? The text tells us he was a Tishbite from Tishbe and Gilead. Gilead was the region east of the Jordan River, a rugged highland territory of deep forests and steep valleys, a place known for its balm and its remoteness. It was not a place of influence or prestige. It was not the kind of place that produced kings or scholars or men of letters. It produced shepherds and farmers and men who knew how to survive in difficult terrain. There is a detail that biblical scholars have puzzled over for centuries. The word Tishbite appears in the Hebrew in a form that carries some ambiguity. Some interpreters suggest it points to a specific place called Tishbai. Others have read it as indicating someone who sojourns, a man without permanent roots, someone passing through. The exact meaning has never been settled with certainty, and that uncertainty feels intentional. A pattern that careful readers of the Hebrew text have consistently noted is that the most important thing about how Elijah is introduced is what the text does not say. No father, no tribe, no lineage, no training, just a name, a region, and a declaration. In a culture where identity was entirely tied to family and ancestry, to be introduced without a father's name was almost to be introduced as someone who exists outside the ordinary system of human categories entirely. He appears, that is all. What we can do, a reconstruct from the tradition, is that Gilead was a place of spiritual marginalization. The centers of power and religious life in Israel were in the west in cities like Samaria and Jezreel. Gilead was the periphery. It was the kind of place where the old ways persisted longer because the new fashions of the capital took longer to arrive. If Elijah grew up in Gilead, in the years leading up to his confrontation with Ahab, he would have grown up watching from a distance as the spiritual center of his nation was hollowed out. He would have heard the reports, the temple of Baal rising in Samaria, the prophets of Yahweh being hunted down and killed, the systematic dismantling of everything his name declared to be true. My God is Yahweh. But Yahweh, it seemed, had been replaced. Think of someone you might know who has lived through a version of this. Someone who watched the institutions they trusted slowly become something unrecognizable. Someone who did not wait for permission nor for an organized movement. Someone who simply said what was true because it was true and because someone had to say it and because they were there. That is the kind of person Gilead produces. Not polished, not credentialed, simply formed by hard terrain and long silence and the knowledge of what is actually true. Before Elijah stands before the king, the Hebrew text gives us one physical detail about him that has captured the imagination of every generation that has read these stories. He is described as a hairy man wearing a leather belt around his waist. Simple, rough, a man of the outdoors, not the palace. When he is later described to a king who has never seen him, the king recognizes who it is immediately from that description alone. He is recognizable not by his position, but by what he looks like. The man from the wilderness. There is a long tradition in the Hebrew scriptures of the wilderness as the place where God forms people for public work. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness of Midian before the burning bush. David fled to the wilderness from Saul. John the Baptist, whom the Gospel of Luke explicitly connects to the Elijah tradition, lived in the wilderness and wore camel's hair and a leather belt, language that deliberately echoes the description of Elijah himself. The wilderness does something to a person that comfort cannot do. It removes the distractions. It takes awe, the scaffolding of social approval and institutional belonging, and the quiet hum of ordinary life that keeps us from having to think about what we actually believe. In the wilderness, the only things left are the hard ground and the open sky and the question of whether what you trust is real. Elijah was formed in that kind of place, and it shows in everything he does. Now we come to the moment of his first appearance. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 1. You need to hear this the way the first readers would have heard it, because the abruptness of it is part of the meaning. He simply appears before Ahab and speaks. He does not request an audience. He is not escorted in by courtiers. He arrives the way truth arrives, without announcing itself, without asking permission, without softening the message to make it easier to receive. And what he says is this: As Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years except by my word. Let us stay in that sentence for a moment. The first thing he does is invoke the name Yahweh, the personal name of the God of Israel, in the court of a king who has spent his reign replacing Yahweh with Baal. That alone is a provocation. That alone in Jezebel's Israel is a potentially fatal thing to say. But the content of the declaration makes it even more significant. Rain. Baal is the god of rain. Baal is the storm god. the one who brings the water that makes the crops grow and keeps the people alive. The entire religious and economic case for Baal worship rested on the idea that Baal controlled the weather and therefore controlled survival. Elijah is not simply announcing a drought. He is announcing that Yahweh, not Baal, controls the rain. He is placing a direct challenge at the center of everything Jezebel's project has built. If there is no rain until Elijah says so, then Baal is nothing. And if Baal is nothing, then everything built around his worship is nothing. The declaration is short. It takes perhaps 15 seconds to say, and then Elijah is gone. The word of Yahweh came to him immediately afterward, telling him to go east and hide himself by the brook Cherith, which flows east of the Jordan. Go into the wilderness. Get out of sight. What has been set in motion will take time, and you will not survive what comes next if you stay. This is the rhythm that will define Elijah's ministry. Declaration, then withdrawal, fire, then silence. The moment of impossible courage, and then the quiet place where God sustains what human endurance cannot. It is easy to read the story of Elijah and focus only on the fire, the moments of confrontation and miracle and divine action. But the story is equally about what happens between those moments. The hiding, the waiting, the days at the brook when nothing seems to be happening, and the only evidence that anything matters is the fact that you are still there, still fed, still breathing. Before Elijah calls fire from Carmel, he spends years at a brook and in a widow's house, learning to receive what he cannot produce himself. That is not a lesser part of the story. That is the foundation of it. The night is long and the story has only just begun. But even here at the very threshold of Elijah's life, something has already been made clear. God does not always choose the person who comes from the right place. He does not always choose the person with the right credentials, or the right family, or the right institutional backing. Sometimes he reaches into the margins, into the remote, and the rough, and the overlooked places, and finds someone with, his name is already a declaration, and he says, go and say what is true, because someone has to say it, and you are there. Chapter 2. The word that shut the sky. Consider what it means to close a sky, not as a figure of speech, not as a theological abstraction. In concrete agricultural survival terms, consider what it means for an entire region to receive no rain and no dew for years. The dew matters as much as the rain. In the land of Israel, particularly in the dry summer months, dew was not a minor meteorological detail. It was the moisture that kept crops from dying between the rains. It settled on the vegetation in the night and kept things alive through the long, dry heat of the day. Farmers depended on it. Shepherds depended on it. The entire ecosystem of the land depended on it. When Elijah stood before Ahab and declared that there would be no dew and no rain except by his word, he was not delivering a polite theological disagreement. He was announcing an ecological catastrophe. He was placing the weight of an entire nation's survival on a declaration about which God was real. And then he disappeared. The command from God was specific. Go east, hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. The geography matters. The Jordan River was the boundary. East of the Jordan was Gilead, Elijah's own homeland, the wilderness territory where he had been formed. God was not sending him somewhere unfamiliar. He was sending him back to the place that made him to wait. The brook Cherith is mentioned nowhere else in the biblical record. Interpreters across the centuries have placed it in different locations, some in the deep ravines east of the Jordan, others along smaller tributaries that would have been nearly invisible on any map. The exact location has never been established with certainty. What matters is what happens there. God says that he has commanded ravens to feed Elijah there, and the ravens bring him bread in the morning and meat in the evening. He drinks from the brook. Now the ravens. This detail has puzzled readers since the earliest commentators. Ravens in the Levitical law given to Moses are listed among the unclean birds. They were not to be eaten. A faithful Israelite who kept the dietary laws would not touch a raven, would not handle a raven, would want nothing to do with a raven. And yet here, at the very beginning of Elijah's ministry, God chooses ravens as the instruments of his provision. Later, interpreters in the Jewish tradition wrestled with this detail at length. One strand of that reflection suggests that God was making a point not just about ravens, but about the nature of provision itself, that he is not constrained by the categories of clean and unclean when it comes to sustaining his servants, that the instrument of his grace does not have to be the expected instrument, that he can use what others dismiss, overlook or consider unsuitable to accomplish what nothing suitable could accomplish. The ravens come in the morning. The ravens come in the evening. Bread, meat, every day. Think about what Elijah's days at Cherith must have been like. He is a man of fire and declaration. He walked into the presence of the most powerful king in Israel and pronounced judgment. He is not by any measure a man designed for stillness. And yet here he is sitting by a small brook in the wilderness, watching the ravens come, waiting for something to happen that is not yet visible. Think of someone you might know who has lived through a season like this, a person always in motion, always building, suddenly brought to saint illness by something outside their control. Someone who told a friend that they had never felt more useless in their life, that they kept looking for the thing they were supposed to be doing, and there was nothing there. Just waiting, just small daily provisions, just the sense that something was happening somewhere that they could not see. And the friend said something that stayed with them. The brook is not a punishment. The brook is preparation. What God is doing at Cherith is not less than what he did at the court of the king. It is the other half of the same work. You cannot sustain what Carmel requires without what Cherith teaches. That understanding does not come quickly. It comes the way the ravens come. One day at a time, bread in the morning, meat in the evening. Day after day, the ravens come. Day after day, the water runs and nothing dramatic happens. And then the brook begins to dry up. The text says it simply, because there was no rain in the land, the brook dried up. This is not mysterious. It is the natural consequence of the very drought. Elijah announced the word he spoke has shut the sky, and the sky being shut is now affecting the place where he is hiding. The version, his proclamation that protects his mission, is also threatening the water supply that sustains him. There is a painful reality in that. The instrument of your purpose can create the conditions of your hardship. The drought that Elijah was called to declare is the same drought that is drying up the brook he needs to survive. His obedience and his difficulty are not separate things. They are connected. God does not explain this. He does not send a message saying, "I know this is difficult. Here is why it is happening, and here is how long it will last." He simply gives a new instruction. Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. Let us pause on the geography because it is significant in a way that the first readers would have felt immediately. Sidon was a Phoenician city. Sidon was not in Israel. Sidon was the homeland of Jezebel herself. This is the region from which she came, the culture from which she imported Baal worship into Israel. And God is sending his prophet directly into the center of that territory. There is a pattern in the Hebrew scriptures that the early readers recognized and that modern readers will sometimes miss. God keeps sending his servants to the unexpected places, not the safe places, not the places where they will be welcomed and supported by people who share their values. Moses is sent to Pharaoh. Jonah is sent to Nineveh. And now Elijah is sent to Zarephath in Sidon, which is Jezebel's country. God does not respect the borders that human hostility draws. The instruction says that God has commanded a widow to feed Elijah. When Elijah arrives at the gate of the city, he finds her immediately. She is gathering sticks. He asks her for water and for bread, and she answers him with one of the most heartbreaking sentences in the entire Hebrew scripture. She says, "As Yahweh your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son that we may eat it and die." She knows his name for God. She uses it, Yahweh, your God. This woman in Jezebel's homeland in the city of Sidon, where Baal is worshipped, knows the name of the God of Israel. She is not making a claim of faith. She is simply using the name this stranger invoked when he asked her for something. Hing. And what she tells him is that she is preparing the last meal she and her son will ever eat. This is who God has sent Elijah to. Not a wealthy benefactor, not a stable household with resources to spare. A widow with a dying child and a handful of flour and a small amount of oil. A woman who is already making peace with the end. Elijah's response is extraordinary in its boldness. Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. but first make me a little cake of it, and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. First make me a cake. He is asking a dying woman to give the last food she has to him before she feeds her starving child. The discomfort of this request is the point. He is asking her to act on a promise before the promise has shown any evidence of being true. For thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that Yahweh sends rain upon the earth. She goes, she does what he says, and the jar of flour is not spent. Every morning she goes to the jar expecting it to be empty. Every morning it is not. Enough for today. Just enough for today. The night is still. The jar is foul. 1. And somewhere across the dry land, something is being prepared that not even Elijah can yet see clearly. He is learning what the word he carries can do. And the next lesson is coming in the form of a child who has stopped breathing. Chapter 3. The widow and the jar that never emptied. There is a kind of grace that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with thunder. It does not part a sea or call down fire or make the ground shake beneath your feet. It simply appears in the ordinary place where you expected nothing, and it keeps appearing quietly every morning in amounts just sufficient for the day. This is the grace Elijah lived inside for nearly 3 years. But before we understand what those years at Zarephath meant for the man who would stand on Carmel, we need to go back to the beginning of that season and stay with it longer than the story usually allows us to, because what happened in that widow's house is not simply a miracle story. It is a school, and Elijah was the student. When God sent Elijah to Zarephath, the drought had already been in effect long enough to hollow out the landscape. The springs were low, the pastures were dry, animals were dying. The kind of slow catastrophe that does not make dramatic news, but quietly dismantles entire communities season by season, had been building across Israel and into the surrounding regions. Zarephath sat on the Phoenician coast, wealthier than most inland towns, with access to trade routes that could import food when local supplies failed. But by the time Elijah arrived, even the widow gathering sticks at the gate was preparing her last meal. The drought had reached the margins of the economy, which is always where catastrophe arrives first. She is not named in the text. The Hebrew tradition does not give her a name. She is identified entirely by her situation. Avodo, a mother, a woman with a son who is running out of time, and she is gathering sticks, which is one of the smallest and most ordinary acts of preparation a person can make. The simplest possible response to a need she can no longer meet with anything more substantial. There is something worth staying with in that image. She is not paralyzed. She is not sitting in her house weeping, though she would have had every reason to. She is outside at the city gate doing the next small thing, gathering sticks. When the flour is almost gone and the oil is almost out, and the child is hungry, and the future has closed down to a single meal, she is still doing the next small thing available to her. That quality, that refusal to stop doing the smallest possible useful thing, even when the larger situation is beyond any hope of repair, is the quality that made her the right person for what was about to happen. A man appears. He asks her for water. Then he asks her for bread, and she tells him the truth. She does not perform optimism. She does not feel. She does not pretend the situation is better than it is. She says exactly what is true. I have a handful of flour and a little oil. I am gathering sticks so I can cook the last meal for my son and for me. And then we will be, she says it plainly, without drama, without excessive despair that would have made the declaration about herself, rather than about the facts. This is also a form of honesty that matters, and Elijah, standing before this woman who has just told him she is preparing to die, says something that should sound outrageous. He says, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a small cake, and bring it to me, and after that make something for yourself and your son. Will first make it for me." Let us not rush past the difficulty of this request, because the text does not rush past it, and neither should we. He is asking a dying woman to give the last food she has to him before she feeds her starving child. The discomfort is the point, because what Elijah is actually asking her to do is to decide in the most concrete possible terms whether she believes the word that follows. He is not asking for her flour. He is asking whether she will act on a promise before the promise has shown any evidence of being true. For thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that Yahweh sends rain upon the earth. The jar will not run out, the jug will not empty. But she has to give first before she sees that. She has to act as though the word is reliable before the word has demonstrated its reliability. This is one of the most demanding things the biblical narrative asks any of its characters to do, and she does it. She goes, she makes the cake, she brings it to Elijah, and then she makes food for herself and her son, and the jar of flour is not spent. The next morning, she goes to the jar, expecting it to be empty. It is not. She goes to the jug. It has oil in it. Enough for today. Just enough for today. This is the nature of the provision at Zarephath, and it is worth examining carefully, because it is not the kind of miracle most people given the choice would have designed. The jar does not overflow. She cannot take from it more than she needs and store the surplus somewhere safe. The provision is exactly sufficient every single day with nothing left over to constitute a margin of security. Every morning she has to go back and find out if today will be provided for. Every morning she has to re-encounter the fact that the promise is still holding. Think of someone who has lived through a season like this, someone caring for a loved one through a long illness, never knowing what the next week would bring, never having a surplus of strength or clarity to bank against what was coming. Someone who said quietly that the hardest part was the dailiness of it, not the weight, though the weight was real, the daily. And then said something like this, "But I always had what I needed for that day, not more, not less." That is Zarephath. The provision is not spectacular, it is not signed to produce awe, or build a crowd, or serve as public evidence of anything. It is a private daily miracle witnessed only by a widow, her son, and a prophet who is himself learning something about the nature of what he carries. Because Elijah is learning something at Zarephath that he could not have learned at Cherith. At Cherith, the provision came to him, the ravens brought it. He was the recipient of something that required nothing from him except to be present and receive. Zarephath is different. At Zarephath, he is the instrument of the provision. He is the one who carries the word, and he is watching every morning as the word he carries does something he cannot explain and did not produce. He is learning that the word in his mouth is not his. This matters enormously for what comes next. When he stands on Carmel before 450 prophets of Baal, the confidence he speaks with will not be the confidence of a man who has worked himself up into a state of religious certainty. It will be the confidence of a man who has watched a jar of flour sustain 3 people through years of drought. He has seen what the word does. Now he knows. And then the Son does. Let us stay in this moment because, it is easy to read it as a transitional scene on the way to the miracle and miss the depth of what is actually happening here. The child's illness comes suddenly and progresses quickly. The text says the sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. This is not ambiguous. The child is dead, and the woman who has fed this prophet from her last resources, who has trusted the word he brought and watched it prove itself every morning, turns to him with a grief that has become something sharp. "What have you against me, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son?" She is not asking a calm theological question. She is accusing him in her understanding of how the divine and the human interact. Suffering is connected to guilt. The presence of a holy man has somehow exposed or activated some sin she carries, and the consequence is her son's death. The ancient world thought this way. Suffering was not random. It meant something. It came from somewhere. And when you could not identify the cause, you looked at yourself because that was the most available explanation. Elijah does not debate her theology. He does not explain. He does something far more urgent than theological correction. He takes the child. He carries the dead boy upstairs to the room where he has been staying. Carmel. She knew about the fire. She knew about the rain. She knew about the 450 prophets of Baal who would not be returning to the royal table. And her response was not fear, not capitulation, not the kind of reckoning that Elijah might have expected after what the entire nation had witnessed. Her response was a death threat, specific, personal, time-stamped. And the man who had stood alone against 450 prophets who had called fire from heaven, who had outrun horses in a rainstorm, got up and ran. He was afraid. The text says it plainly without apology or explanation. He arose and ran for his life. This is one of the most discussed moments in the entire Elijah narrative. and it has produced centuries of commentary, most of it trying to explain how the bravest man in Israel could be undone by a single message from a woman he had just publicly defeated. The explanations usually focus on faith, on the failure of faith, on Elijah momentarily losing sight of the God who had just answered by fire. But there is another way to understand this moment, and it requires us to look not at what Elijah believed in that moment, but at what his body and spirit had been through in the years and days leading up to it. Dinging up to it, consider the accumulation, 3.5 years of hiddenness, 3.5 years of carrying the weight of a national judgment, knowing the drought was connected to the word in his mouth, watching the land suffer while he waited in Zarephath for the moment God would send him back. Then the journey back to Israel, the encounter with Odiah, the confrontation with Ahab, the long day on Carmel, beginning with his speech to the assembled nation and ending with the judgment at the brook Kishon. Then the 7 trips back and forth to look at the sea. Then the run to Jezreel in the storm. He has given everything he has. He has burned through every reserve of physical, emotional, and spiritual energy he possessed. He arrived at Jezreel empty. And then the message came. We have a word for this now. We call it burnout, but the word is too small for what it describes. What it points to is the collapse of the inner structures that make it possible to continue. Those who have studied this pattern have found that the collapse often comes not during the hardest season, but in the quiet immediately after it. And they have found something else. It is often the people who care most, saint, who are most committed to the work, who push through the most, who are most vulnerable to this collapse, because they use caring itself as the fuel that keeps them going past the point where the tank is empty. And when caring runs out, there is nothing underneath it. The person who held everything together through the crisis falls apart when it is over, because the signal finally arrives that the emergency has ended, and the body and spirit respond by releasing everything they have been holding. Elijah received that signal when he arrived in Jezreel. The fire had fallen. The rain had come. He had run ahead of the horses. It was over. And then the message came. In any normal state of reserve, Elijah would likely have responded to that message differently. He had faced Ahab face to face. He had stood before 450 hostile men on their own mountain. A written message from a queen who was not even physically present would not, under ordinary circumstances, have been the thing that broke him. But he was not in any normal state. He was in the state of a man who had just spent everything he had and had not yet been given anything back. The message was not the cause of what happened next. The message was simply the moment when everything he had been holding finally fell. He ran south past Beersheba, which was the southernmost city of Judah, the edge of inhabited land. He leaves his servant there, and then he goes a day's journey further into the wilderness alone after years of isolation, after the greatest public victory of his life, after the rain and the running and the morning message, and he sits down under a juniper tree. The Hebrew word for the tree is rotham. It is what we would call a broom tree, a desert shrub with thin branches and small white flowers that provides minimal shade in the relentless desert sun. It is not a tree that anyone would choose to rest under if they had better options. It is the tree you sit under when it is the only thing between you and nothing. And under that tree, Elijah speaks, "It is enough." 2 words in English. In Hebrew, even shorter, ra enough. It is enough. O Yahweh, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. He is not pretending. He is not performing the kind of prayer that looks good. He is saying with the last coherent words he has left that he wants to stop. And the reason he gives is not what we might expect. He does not say, "I have failed." He does not enumerate the ways in which the events of the last day have demonstrated that everything he did was pointless. He says, "I am not better than my fathers. I am just a man. I am not the exception. I am not the one who is different enough from every human being who has come before me to sustain what this requires. I am ordinary. I am breakable. It is enough." And then he lies down and sleeps. Think of the people who have sat under their own version of this tree. Someone who gave years to a demanding calling, holding everything together, and then one morning simply could not continue as they had been continuing. Not because the belief was gone, not because the work was wrong, because the vessel was empty, and the next step was genuinely beyond what they had left. The most honest thing such a person can say is exactly what Elijah said. It is enough. I have nothing left. Take this. And what they needed, what Elijah needed, was not a sermon or a correction or a reminder of how much work remained undone. It was someone showing up with food. God's response to this prayer is one of the most remarkable things in the entire Hebrew Scripture. He does not answer the theological content of the prayer. He does not explain why Elijah's work is not finished, or what the larger plan is, or why the death threat from Jezebel is not as serious as it seems. He does not offer comfort in the form of information. He sends an angel, and the angel does not preach. The angel does not instruct. The angel does not correct Elijah's theology or challenge his despair. The angel touches him and says, "Arise and eat." Elijah looks, and there is a cake baked on hot coals and a jar of water. Two things, the most basic things, food and water, the minimum requirements for a body that is still alive. He eats, he drinks, he lies down again. The angel comes a second time, touches him again. "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." Why is there a second time? Why does it happen twice? Because once was not enough, because a man who has been running on empty for years does not recover in one meal. Because the rebuilding of a depleted human being does not happen in a single intervention. The angel knows this, or rather, the God who sent the angel knows this. Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. The journey is too great for you. You are too weak for the journey. Not you have failed to prepare adequately. The journey is too great. The acknowledgement is of the genuine difficulty, not of the person's deficiency. The thing you are carrying is genuinely heavy. The distance ahead is genuinely far. This is not your failure. This is simply what is true. So eat. There is a clarity in this moment that cuts through centuries of religious language about the importance of perseverance and the need to press through difficulty. The angel does not tell Elijah to pray harder. The angel does not tell him to remember what God did on Carmel. The angel does not give him a theological framework for understanding his suffering. The angel gives him bread and water and tells him to sleep, and then gives him bread and water again. The body matters. The depleted human spirit matters. God meets Elijah not where Elijah's theology is, but where Elijah's body is under a desert shrub, wanting to stop, unable to continue. And the response is bread. This pattern runs through the entire biblical narrative in ways that theological reflection sometimes overlooks. When Hagar is in the wilderness with her dying son, an angel shows her a well of water. When the disciples have fished all night and caught nothing, the risen Jesus is on the shore with fish already on a fire. When the crowd is hungry in the wilderness, bread is multiplied. The God of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures is consistently, almost insistently, interested in the physical requirements of the people he loves. Elijah sleeps. Elijah eats. Elijah drinks, and then he gets up. The text says that he arose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. 40 days and 40 nights. The number carries weight in the Hebrew tradition. Moses spent 40 days on sea receiving the law. The Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness between Egypt and the Promised Land. Jesus will spend 40 days in the wilderness before his public ministry begins. The number carries the sense of a complete transitional period, the full span of what a significant passage requires. Elijah walks for 40 days and 40 nights on the strength of 2 meals, not on the strength of a sermon, not on the strength of renewed vision, not on the strength of a fresh conviction about the importance of what he is doing, on bread baked on hot coals why an angel and water in a yah. The journey is too great for you, but you ate, and now you can walk. He is going to Horeb, the mountain of God, the place where Moses stood and received everything that defined what Israel was supposed to be, the place where the covenant between Yahweh and the people of Israel was established in fire and cloud and the sound of a voice from the summit. Elijah is not walking toward Jezebel. He is not walking toward Ahab. He is walking toward the source. He is walking to the place where everything began, because the man who was given everything needs to go back to the beginning and find out if the beginning is still there. And it is. It always was. It will be waiting for him when he arrives, not with fire this time. Not with earthquake or wind or any of the dramatic signs that a man who is used to the dramatic might expect. With something quieter, Something so quiet that you can only hear it when everything else has finally stopped. The bread was enough to get him there, and what is waiting for him at Horeb will be enough to send him out again. Chapter 7. Under the juniper tree. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep cannot fix. You have felt it, perhaps. You are feeling it tonight. The kind that is not in your muscles or your eyes or the weight of your body against the bed. The kind that lives somewhere deeper than any of that. In the place where you keep your reasons for continuing. In the space where your sense of purpose used to be before the long season of giving, everything hollowed it out and left something quieter and harder to name in its place. Let us stay under this tree a while longer, not to repeat what brought Elijah here. We have already walked that road. We know the accumulation of it, the years at Cherith and Zarephath, the fire on Carmel, the run to Jezreel, the message in the morning. We know how a man arrives at this particular tree in this particular desert asking for this particular thing. What we have not yet done is stay inside the prayer itself. It is enough, O Yahweh. Take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. The word rav in Hebrew means sufficient at the point of saturation, full to the limit. It appears throughout the Hebrew scriptures in many contexts, and here it means the capacity has been reached. No more can be added. Something has to change because there is nothing left to put into the continuation of what has been. No, enough. Elijah is not saying that his life has been meaningless. He is not saying the work was wrong. He is saying that he has reached the limit of what he can hold. The vessel is full to its limit and cannot receive another thing. And then the most revealing phrase, I am not better than my fathers. His fathers were mortal men, limited, breakable, ordinary human beings who lived and struggled and died. And what Elijah is saying in the most honest moment of his life is that he is one of them. He is not the indestructible prophet who can sustain impossible demands indefinitely without consequence. He is a mortal man made of the same material as every other mortal man who came before him. He is not complaining, he is confessing. He is confessing his humanity to the God who made him human. And in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, the confession of humanity is not a failure of faith, it is a form of it. It is the acknowledgement that you are not God, that you cannot sustain what only God can sustain, that the difference between you and the one you serve is not a problem to be overcome, but a reality to be received. I am not better than my fathers. I am a man. I am your man. But I am a man. And then he sleeps. He does not wait for an answer. He does not maintain a vigil. He simply closes his eyes because he is exhausted and his body will not cooperate with any other plan. He sleeps and then something touches him. The text says an angel touched him. The Hebrew word for angel is malo, which means messenger, one who is sent, one who carries something from a source to a destination. And the word for touched is naga, which in its most common usage carries a gentleness. It is the kind of touch that says, I am here. You are not alone. Something knows you are here. And the angel says 4 words, arise and eat, not pull yourself together. Not remember what you are called to, not a single word about what Elijah has left undone or what is still required of him. Arise and eat. Elijah opens his eyes. And there near his head is a cake baked on hot coals and a jar of water. Someone has been here. Someone has built a fire in the wilderness where no fire was when Elijah sat down. Someone has baked bread on that fire. Someone has brought water in a jar to a man in a desert who asked to die. He eats, he drinks, he lies down again. Let us pause her. Because this second lying down is often passed over quickly, and it should not be. Elijah eats and drinks, and then lies down again. He is not revived in one meal. He does not arise from the first provision full of renewed purpose. He eats, and then goes back to sleep. This is not a failure of gratitude. This is a man whose recovery requires more than one meal, whose depletion is deep enough that the first layer of restoration does not reach the bottom of it. And God knows this. The angel comes again a second time, touches him again, and this time the words carry something more. Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. The journey is too great for you. This is one of the most compassionate sentences spoken by God in the entire Hebrew scripture. And it is compassionate precisely because of what it acknowledges. It does not say the journey is too great for a weak or faithless person. It says the journey is too great, full stop. The journey itself in its own nature exceeds what a single human being can sustain without being replenished. The acknowledgement is of reality, not deficiency. The thing you are carrying is genuinely heavy. The distance you are asked to travel is general, genuinely far. The work ahead is genuinely more than you have in you right now. This is not your failure. This is simply what is true. Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. Think of someone who has spent years in work that demanded more than they had. Someone who learned over time that the most dangerous belief in such work is the belief that you should be able to handle it without being handled yourself, that you can keep giving from a place that is never replenished. That one meal is enough, and then you press on. The angel did not come to Elijah and say you should have managed your resources better. The angel came and said the journey is too great for you. Eat and then eat again, because one time was not enough. The journey is too great for everyone. That is not the problem. The problem is pretending otherwise. Elijah eats the second time. He drinks the second time. And he arrives, and he walks 40 days and 40 nights. The text says, in the strength of that food to Horeb, the mount of God. He did not know when he lay down under the broom tree and asked to die that he was about to walk to sea. He did not know that what he thought was the end of his story was the beginning of its final chapter. He did not know that the cave at Horeb would be the place where he would receive the clearest word he had ever received from the God he served. He ate in the dark, not knowing what the bread was for. He got up, not knowing where the walking would lead. He walked 40 days in the strength of food he had not asked for, given by a messenger he had not summoned, at the instruction of a God who answered his request to die with bread. And he arrived at Horeb, the mount of God, the place where Moses heard the voice from the burning bush, the place where the covenant between Yahweh and the people was forged in fire and cloud and thunder, the holiest ground in the memory of Israel. He went into a cave there and spent the night. The cave, after the open confrontation of Carmel and the open road of the wilderness and the open desert under the broom tree, he is in a cave, enclosed, hidden, small. And then the word of Yahweh came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It is a question, not an accusation, not a rebuke, a question. What are you doing here? And Elijah answers, he has been very jealous for Yahweh, the God of hosts. The people of Israel have forsaken, end the covenant. They have thrown down the altars. They have killed the prophets with the sword, and he alone is left. And they seek his life to take it away. He alone is left. This is not strictly speaking accurate. There are 7,000 people in Israel who have not bowed to Baal as God will shortly tell him. Obadiah is still at his post. The Hund prophets in hiding are still alive. He is not literally the last faithful person in Israel, but it is accurate as a feeling. And the feeling is what Elijah has access to in this cave, not the statistical reality of how many faithful people remain. The felt reality of a man who has been alone in the work for so long that alone has become the only category available to him. God does not correct the feeling. God does not say, actually, you are wrong. Here are the numbers. God says, go out and stand on the mount before me. Not explain yourself. Not let me tell you why your theology is mistaken. Go out, stand, be present. Be on the mountain with your body, not just your exhaustion. And Elijah goes to stand before the God who met him with bread, before he asked for bread, to stand in the place where the covenant was first spoken, to hear something he has not yet heard in all the years of his ministry. Something smaller than fire, something quieter than thunder, something that can only reach a man who has nothing left to make noise with. The mountain is waiting. And what waits there has been waiting since before Elijah was formed in Gilead, since before the drought, since before the ravens and the widow and the fire on Carmel. It has been waiting for exactly this, for the moment when he is empty enough to hear it. Chapter 8, the still small voice. The mountain remembered everything. Orb. The name echoes through the Hebrew tradition with a weight that every Israelite who heard it would have recognized immediately and completely. This was the mountain of the covenant, the mountain of the law, the mountain where Moses stood before the burning bush and heard his name spoken by something that was on fire without being consumed, the mountain where Yahweh came down in cloud and thunder and spoke to the assembled people of Israel in a voice so overwhelming that they begged Moses to hear it for them because they could not bear it themselves. This was the mountain where Israel became Israel. And now, standing at the entrance of a cave on the side of that mountain, wrapped in his cloak, is a man who has just told God twice that he is the only faithful person left and that he would like to stop existing. The distance between those two realities could not be greater. And yet God has sent him here, not to a new place with no associations, to the most historically weighted piece of ground in the entire Israelite tradition. There is something being said in that choice of location. You will not find what you need in a new place. You will find it in the oldest place, in the place where the foundation was laid, in the place where the original word was spoken, in the place that remembers what has always been true before any of the events of your life obscured it. When Elijah arrived at Horeb, he went into a cave and spent the night. Some interpreters across the centuries have identified the location as the same cliff in the rock where Moses stood when Yahweh passed by and proclaimed his own name in the book of Exodus. The same hidden place in the same mountain, as though the mountain keeps a room ready for this kind of moment. A place it holds open for the servants of God who arrive depleted and in need of something the ordinary worship, ILD, cannot provide. The word of Yahweh came to Elijah there and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The question matters. Let us spend time with it. In the Hebrew, the question carries more intimacy than the English translation suggests. It is not a formal inquiry. It is something closer to tell me. Tell me where you are, not because I do not know, but because the telling of it is part of what you need. There is wisdom in asking not what happened, but where you are. Because a person in acute suffering is very specifically located in a particular place. Inside themselves, and naming that location is the first step toward being able to move from it. You cannot be led somewhere if you have not first acknowledged where you are. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah tells him he has been very jealous for Yahweh. The people have forsaken the covenant. The altars are destroyed. The prophets are dead. He is the only one left, and they are looking for him to kill him. The same words he said before God told him to stand on the mountain. The same assessment, the same conclusion. I alone am left. And now God responds in a way Elijah has not yet experienced. He says, "Go out and stand on T. He mount before me." And Elijah goes, and then the phenomena begin. A great wind comes that tears the mountains and breaks the rocks in pieces before Yahweh. But Yahweh is not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but Yahweh is not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but Yahweh is not in the fire. Stay with this sequence because it is deliberate and the repetition is important. Three of the most powerful phenomena in the natural world: wind that tears mountains, an earthquake that shakes the ground, fire, and God is in none of them. This is astonishing in the context of everything that has come before in the Elijah story, because Yahweh has been in fire before. The fire on Carmel was explicitly called the fire of Yahweh. The text said so, and now at Horeb fire comes and Yahweh is not in it. What has changed? Interpreters across the centuries have approached this question from many directions. Some suggest God is demonstrating his freedom, his refusal to be contained in the forms that human expectation assigns to him. Some suggest it is a specific word to Elijah, who has become so oriented toward the dramatic that he needs to be taught to find God in something smaller. Some suggest it is a demonstration that God exceeds every natural phenomenon that might be used to represent him. All of these readings contain something true, but there is another dimension that the structure of the story itself suggests. Elijah came to Horeb as a man whose system of receiving God through the dramatic and the powerful had been completely depleted. He came as a man who had run on the fuel of extraordinary events for so long that the extraordinary had nothing left to give him. And God at Horeb does not give him more extraordinary events. He gives him something that cannot be metabolized into mission fuel or prophetic momentum. He gives him a voice so small that you can only hear it when everything else has stopped. After the fire, a still small voice. The Hebrew is called Dima Daka, 3 words that carry more weight than any translation can fully convey. Kul means voice, or sound, or call. Dirmama comes from a root meaning silence, stillness, the cessation of sound. It carries within it the weight of absence of the space where sound has not yet arrived or has already ended. Daka means thin or fine or reduced to the smallest possible substance, the thin, nest possible layer of something. Put them together. A voice of thin silence, a sound of fine stillness, something that occupies the space where sound and silence have become almost indistinguishable. Later, interpreters have described it in various ways. The ancient Greek translation rendered it as a sound of gentle breezes. The Latin tradition that shaped Western Christianity for over 1,000 years described it as a still small voice. The great 20th century Jewish philosopher Martin Buber approached the phrase as something closer to a sound of fine silence. Many scholars feel this rendering captures what the Hebrew does that any single translation cannot fully reach. A sound of fine silence, not simply a quiet voice, as though the divine has lowered the volume of its ordinary communication. Something heard not by the ears exactly, but by the part of a person that is only available when everything else has stopped making noise. And when Elijah hears that thin, still voice, he does something that tells us everything about what he has recognized. He wraps his face in his mantle, his cloak, he covers himself, and he goes and stands at the entrance of the cave. He does not cover his face in fear. He covers his face in recognition. He has heard something that he knows in the deepest part of himself is the presence of the one he has been serving all these years. And the response is not the response of a man afraid of judgment. It is the response of a man who has just been found. He covers his face because you cannot look at what he has heard. You can only receive it. And that thin, still voice asks him the same question it asked before. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The same question, exactly, word for word. This is significant. God is not asking because he does not know. God is asking because Elijah needs to say it again. He needs to hear his own honest answer in the presence of the voice that just came after the wind and the earthquake and the fire. And Elijah gives the same answer, word for word. "I have been very jealous for Yahweh. The people have forsaken the covenant. The altars are thrown down. The prophets are dead. I alone am left, and they seek my life." He still believes he is alone. The wind and the earthquake and the fire have not changed that. Even the thin, still voice has not yet changed that. But now, the response is different. God does not ask a third question. He gives instructions, 3 specific things to do. Go back the way you came. Anoint Hazael as king over Syria. Anoint Jehu as king over Israel. Anoint Elisha as prophet in your place. There is work yet to do. 3 anointings, 3 acts that will shift the political and spiritual landscape of the entire region. The story Elijah thought was ending is not ending. The chapter he thought was the final chapter is not the final chapter. And then God adds something that shifts everything. "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal and every mouth that has not kissed him." 7,000, not one. Not Elijah alone in the dark. 7,000 people who have been quietly, invisibly, faithfully refusing to bow. 7,000 whose faithfulness left no dramatic public record. 7,000 who were sustaining the covenant in the ways available to them, in the places they occupied, without fire from heaven, and without the confrontation of kings. Elijah did not know about them. He had no way of knowing. He was so deep inside the experience of his own isolation that the 7,000 were invisible to him. But they were there. They had always been there. Think of someone who has been there, or a long season of feeling like the last person standing. Someone who watched something they loved fall apart, who found themselves in the aftermath feeling entirely alone in caring about what had been lost, and who then discovered slowly that there were others, people who had felt exactly what they felt and had stayed anyway, people who were not visible in the public story of what had happened. 7,000. I did not know about the 7,000, and if someone had said to them, "You were one of them," they would not have thought of it that way, but it would have been true. You are not the last person who is holding what you are holding. You cannot see everyone who is standing in the same place you are standing. The cave will always feel like it contains only you. But the mountain contains 7,000 people you cannot see from where you are. The 7,000 are there. They have always been there. God does not explain to Elijah why the wind and the earthquake and the fire were not him. He simply gives Elijah the instructions and the information he needs and sends him back. Go return. Anoint Elisha. The cave is not your final address. And now, having heard that 7,000 are there, something shifts in the weight of what Elijah carries. Not because the exhaustion is gone, not because the isolation has been replaced by warmth, but because the story he has been telling himself about being alone has been gently, precisely, irreversibly corrected. You are not alone. There are 7,000. And from that knowing, however quiet and new and not yet fully felt, the direction of shalom becomes visible. Shalom, the word that appears at the end of the oldest priestly blessing in the Israelite tradition. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you shalom. Shalom is usually translated as peace, but the word carries more than peace in its ordinary English sense. It carries the sense of wholeness, the state of a thing that has all its parts in their right relationship to each other. A person whose inner and outer life are aligned, whose past and present and future are held together in a coherent story. Elijah did not come down from Horeb with shalom in that full sense. He came down with instructions, with the knowledge that 7,000 people were keeping faith in ways he could not see, with that fine silence still resonating somewhere. Here inside him, that was enough to walk back into the world. Shalom is not always a feeling. Sometimes it is a direction. And the direction from the cave at Horeb is back toward the field where a young man is plowing, back toward the cloak that is about to find its next bearer, back toward the continuation of the work that does not end when any one person can no longer carry it alone. Elijah came to Horeb carrying the words, "I alone am left." He left Horeb carrying the words 7,000. That is what the mountain does. Not the wind, not the earthquake, not the fire, the voice. Thin, still, quiet and sufficient for everything that comes next. Chapter 9. Elisha and the mantle. Every great fire eventually finds its hearth, not because the fire grows weaker, though it may, not because the burning is less real than it was in the beginning, though the shape of it changes with time, but because fire by its nature passes heat from one thing to the next. That is what fire does. It does not hoard what it has. It reaches toward the nearest available material and gives itself to it, and what catches becomes in its own way fire. Elijah had been burning for a long time. He had burned through Sher, Ith and Zarephath and Carmel, and the wilderness and the cave at Horeb. He had burned in confrontation and in hiding and in grief and in the exhausted prayer under the broom tree. He had burned in ways that were visible to an entire nation and in ways that were visible to no one at all. And now God had told him something he had not expected to hear. Go and anoint Elisha to be prophet in your place. In your place. Not alongside you. Not in addition to you. In your place. Every person who has given years of their life to something they love, who has built something slowly and carefully and at great personal cost, knows what those 3 words cost to hear. The work will continue. The fire will keep burning, but you will not be the one carrying it. This is one of the hardest gifts God gives. And Elijah receives it with a simplicity that, once you understand what is being asked, is almost breathtaking in its completeness. He goes, he finds Elisha, he gives him the cloak, and that is the whole of it. Let us travel to the place where this happens because the location matters. God sends Elijah through the land of Israel, and he finds Elisha in the valley of Abel-Maholah. Abel-Mah was a fertile agricultural region in the Jordan Valley. The soil there was rich, and the land was productive, which is why Elisha's family had 12 yoke of oxen. A single yoke of oxen was enough for a small farming operation. 12 yoke represents a substantial enterprise, a family of means, a household that had built something solid and secure over generations. Elisha was not a poor man's son. He was not someone on the margins with nothing to lose. He was plowing the family land with the family oxen, doing the work that had sustained his household for years, the work that would continue to sustain it after him, the work that was his inheritance and his future. He was by every ordinary measure exactly where he was supposed to be, and Elijah walked past him and threw his mantle over him. That is all, no words recorded, no explanation offered. A man walking past a field throws his cloak over the shoulders of a man plowing. In the ancient world, and specifically in the prophetic tradition of Israel, this gesture had a meaning that every observer would have understood immediately. The mantle was not simply clothing. It was the external symbol of the prophet's calling and authority. When Elijah put his cloak on, and Elisha, he was performing an act of designation. He was saying without a single word that what he carried was now available to this man. The question was whether Elisha would receive it, and Elisha's response is immediate. He leaves the oxen. He runs after Elijah, and he asks for one thing. Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. Let me say goodbye. Before I do this irreversible thing, let me go back to the people who love me and tell them what is happening. Let me say what needs to be said to the ones who will feel my absence most. Elijah's response to this request is one of the most discussed passages in the narrative. He says, "Go back again, for what have I done to you? What have I done to you?" The sentence is strange in almost every direction you approach it from. Some interpreters read it as gentle permission. Go back if you must. I have not obligated you. Others read it as a quiet challenge. Go back if you must, but consider what you are choosing. Others read it as a statement of weight. What I have done to you by throwing this cloak is a real thing. Do not go back and forget what it felt like when it landed on your shoulders. What have I done to you? Whatever Elijah means by it, Elisha hears it and makes his choice. He goes back. He takes the yoke of oxen. He slaughters them. He uses the wooden equipment of the plow as fuel and cooks the meat. He gives it to the people around him and they eat. And then he arises and follows Elijah and ministers to him. The slaughter of the oxen is Elisha's version of burning the boats. He takes the instruments of his former life, the oxen that were his family's wealth and his own future security, and he turns them into a farewell meal. He feeds the people around him with what he is leaving behind. Think of someone you might know who has faced a version of this. Someone who spent years building something secure and then found themselves standing at a threshold they had not planned for. Someone for whom the hardest part was not the decision itself, which clarified in the end, but what they called the oxen, the things they had to walk away from that had genuine value. Not bad things, not wrong things, good things that other people legitimately wanted and that they had worked for. The important thing such a person might say afterward was not simply leaving, it was doing something purposeful with what was being left behind. Giving it to someone who could use it rather than simply abandoning it. That was what made it a real threshold rather than just a retreat. Elisha feeds the people and then he leaves. He follows Elijah. He serves him. The text says he ministered to him. He becomes the attendant of the prophet, the one who walks alongside and learns what he is being prepared to carry. Years pass. The text does not give us the precise duration, but the tradition understands it as a substantial period. Elisha is watching everything. How Elijah prays and how Elijah confronts power and how Elijah fails and how Elijah gets back up. He is learning not just the content of the prophetic calling but the texture of it, what it costs, what it requires, what it produces in the person who carries it for a long time. There is no shortcut to the knowledge that comes from sustained proximity to someone who carries something true. You cannot read about it and arrive at the same place. The knowledge Elisha acquires in the years of walking alongside Elijah is the kind that lives in the instincts, in the responses shaped by watching the same person navigate the same pressures in the same situation. He watches Elijah and gradually over years he becomes someone who can carry what Elijah carries. But before the mantle is formally transferred, there is one more confrontation that Elijah must make, one more moment of standing before power and saying what is true. The story of Naboth's vineyard. Naboth was an Israelite man who owned a vineyard near the palace of Ahab in Jezreel. The vineyard had been in his family for generations. Ahab wanted it. He offered Naboth a fair exchange, either a better vineyard elsewhere or the monetary value of the land. He was not initially trying to take it unjustly. Naboth refused. His reason was rooted in the covenant law of Israel. The land of Naboth's fathers was not simply property in the modern sense of something that can be bought and sold at will. It was his inheritance, his family's portion of the covenant promise, their share in the land that Yahweh had given to Israel. To permanently transfer that land would be to sever the family from their place in the covenant. Naboth was not being obstinate, he was being faithful. Ahab understood this, and he went home and sulked, which is one of the more undignified moments in the record of the Kings. He lay on his bed and turned his face to the wall and refused to eat. And Jezebel found him there. She was not interested in the theological complexity of Naboth's position. She operated under a different understanding of the relationship between monarchs and their subjects. In her framework, the king's desire functioned as the legal framework. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his seal, and sent them to the elders of Jezreel. The letters instructed them to arrange a public accusation against Naboth on false charges and to carry out the legal consequences. They did it because the system that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse had been so thoroughly corrupted that there was no one left inside it willing to refuse. Naboth died, an innocent man faithful to the covenant of his fathers, killed for a piece of ground that his family had held for generations. The vineyard he had refused to surrender now stood empty, available for a king who had done nothing to deserve it. This is the weight of what Elijah is walking toward. When God sends him to Jezreel, and when he arrives at the vineyard and Ahab sees him, the king says again what he always says. Have you found me, O my enemy? He has not changed. Elijah is still in Ahab's understanding the troubler, the man responsible for Israel's suffering. And Elijah says, I have found you because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of Yahweh. And then he delivers the word that traces the consequence of what has been done all the way to its end. It is a severer word. The biblical text states it plainly and does not dwell on its details, and neither will we. What matters here is not the severity of the judgment, but what happens immediately after it is delivered. Because something unexpected happens. Ahab hears the word and he repents. He tears his clothes. He fasts. He lies in sackcloth. He goes about quietly. The text says he walked softly, which is the Hebrew way of describing a person who has been brought genuinely low by the recognition of what they have done. And Yahweh says to Elijah, Have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the disaster in his days. Even Ahab, even the king whose reign was described as the worst in the history of Israel, even the man who stood passively with Baal, his wife, arranged the death of an innocent man for a vineyard, even he has within him the capacity to hear and to soften and to turn, and God sees it and responds to it. The disaster will still come. The consequences of what has been set in motion cannot be entirely reversed, but they are delayed because he humbled himself. This is one of the most important moments in the Elijah narrative and one of the least discussed. It disrupts the clean narrative of the righteous prophet and the wicked king with something more complicated and more true. It shows us that the categories of righteous and wicked are not in the Hebrew tradition sealed and permanent. Even the most compromised human being in the record can in the right moment with the right hearing turn. And the God who counts 7,000 people who have not bowed is also the God who notices when one person who has bowed his entire life briefly turns his face in the other direction. He sees Ahab, he responds. This is Elijah's last word to Ahab. He will not speak to him again. The long confrontation between these two men, which began with a declaration of drought in the king's court and continued through the years of drought and the fire, of Carmel and the rain and the word about Naboth's vineyard, is complete. Now there is only one thing left, the transfer. The tradition tells us that Elijah and Elisha made a final journey together through the land from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho to the Jordan. 4 stops. The geography of a country that Elijah has walked across for the entirety of his ministry. As if the route itself is a form of farewell, a last movement through the landscape of a life given entirely to a calling. At each stop, Elijah says the same thing to Elisha. Stay here, for Yahweh has sent me on. And at each stop, Elisha gives the same answer. As Yahweh lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. 3 times the same offer and the same refusal. Elijah keeps giving Elisha the chance to stop. Elisha keeps refusing to take it. There is a community of prophets at each stop, younger men training in the prophetic tradition. At each stop, they approach Elisha privately and ask, Do you know that today Yahweh will take away your master from over you? And Elisha says, Yes, I know it. Be silent. He knows. He has known for some time that this day was coming. He does not want the weight of it narrated elsewhere, understood by people who are watching from the outside. He wants to be present for it without the commentary. They reach the Jordan. Elijah takes his mantle and rolls it up and strikes the water with it, and the water parts to the right and to the left, and the two of them cross over on dry ground. The echo is deliberate. Moses and the sea, Joshua and the Jordan. And now Elijah and the Jordan, the same God, the same pattern, the same water, yielding to the same authority. When they have crossed, Elijah asks, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" And Elisha asks for what he has come all this way to ask for. "Please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me." In Hebrew inheritance law, the firstborn son received a double portion of his father's estate. It was not a request for twice as much as Elijah had. It was a request for the inheritance of the firstborn, the portion that belongs to the primary heir. Elisha is asking to be recognized as the legitimate successor, the one who carries forward what Elijah carried. It is not an arrogant request, it is an honest one, and Elijah's answer is careful. "You have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." The condition is seeing, not doing, not achieving, not passing a theological test. Seeing, be present for what is about to happen. Watch it fully. Do not look away. And then the chariot of fire appeared. Horses of fire, a chariot of fire coming between the two of them, and a whirlwind lifting Elijah up away into the sky until he was gone. One sentence for the most extraordinary departure in the biblical record. The same restraint the text used for the fire on Carmel. One sentence because the event exceeds anything that additional words could add to it. Elisha sees it. He sees it all. He cries out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. My father, not my master, not my teacher, my father." This is the word that describes the relationship formed over the years of walking together. Elisha has not simply learned from Elijah. He has been fathered by him in the deepest sense of that word, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. A chariot and its horses represent military protection in the ancient world. Elisha is saying that Elijah himself was the true protection of Israel, that the security of the nation was not its military resources or its political alliances, but the presence of a man who carried the word of the living God. And now that man is gone, Elisha tears his clothes in grief. He does not pretend that this is not loss. It is loss. The man who fathered him in the work has been taken, and the tearing of the clothes is the honest acknowledgement of it. And then he looks down. The mantle of Elijah has fallen. It is lying on the ground where the chariot came between them. The cloak that was thrown over Elisha's shoulders in the field at Abel Maholah all those years ago. The mantle that represented everything Elijah carried. It is here. Elisha picks it up. He goes back to the bank of the Jordan. He takes the mantle of Elijah and strikes the water, saying, "Where is Yahweh, the God of Elijah?" And the water parts to the right and to the left. Same water, same God, different man, same result. The sons of the prophets watching from the other bank see it, and they say the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. Not a copy of Elijah, not a replacement in the sense of something interchangeable. The spirit that Elijah carried has found its next vessel. The fire has round its next hearth. The word that was in Elijah's mouth is now available to the mouth of the man standing at the Jordan with a cloak in his hands. The mantle has found its bearer, and the work continues. Every fire eventually finds its hearth, and every hearth eventually sends the fire on. That is not the diminishment of the fire. That is its nature. That is what fire does. Chapter 10. The chariot of fire. Nothing that is truly given is ever truly gone. This is one of the hardest things to believe, and one of the most persistently demonstrated realities in the entire biblical record. We are not by nature a species that finds it easy to trust the continuation of what we love beyond the point where we can no longer see it. We are oriented toward the visible. We trust what we can touch and confirm with our senses. And when something we love moves beyond the range of what we can confirm, the very human response is to treat it as lost. The biblical text does not describe Elijah dying in the ordinary way. He did not lie down in old age like the patriarchs. He was not struck down by illness or enemy or the ordinary course of a human life. The text says he went up by a whirlwind into heaven. The Hebrew word for whirlwind is es, a word that appears in the tradition to describe the most intense and overwhelming movement of wind, the kind that is beyond ordinary wind, the way a river in flood is beyond ordinary water, wind that carries within it something of the divine. And in that sour Elia went up, the same God who had sustained him through the drought, and the ravens, and the widow's house, and the fire on Carmel, and bread under the broom tree, and the thin, still voice at Horeb, was present at his departure, and he did not let Elijah fall. Among the clearest accounts in the Hebrew scripture, There are two figures described as being taken by God in a way that bypasses the ordinary experience of death. The first is Enoch, described briefly in the book of Genesis, about whom the text simply says he walked with God and he was not, for God took him. No detail, no account of what this looked like, just the statement that walking with God had a particular consequence for this man. The second is Elijah, and unlike Enoch, whose departure is a single sentence in a genealogy, Elijah's is described in detail, witnessed by Elisha, and immediately followed by the continuation of the work Elijah had been doing. The chariot came, the fire came, the whirlwind came, and Elijah was gone. Elisha stood at the Jordan with the cloak. The sons of the prophets looked for Elijah for 3 days, insisting that perhaps the Spirit of Yahweh had set him on some mountain or in some valley. Elisha told them not to search. They searched anyway, because the human resistance to accepting an irreversible departure is strong and almost universal. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. He had been taken. The tradition immediately began asking a question that would persist across every generation that came after. Where did he go? And more urgently, will he come back? The prophet Malachi, writing in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets, says in the closing words of the prophetic collection, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of Yahweh comes. He will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers." Elijah will come before the day of Yahweh. The tradition held this promise carefully across the centuries that followed. When Jewish families gathered for the Passover meal, they set a place at the table for Elijah. They poured a cup of wine for him. Near the end of the meal, the door of the house was opened, and the family looked out into the night, as if expecting to see the rough figure of the man from Gilead standing on the threshold, returned from wherever the whirlwind carried him, ready to announce that the day they had waited for was finally here. The cup of Elijah, set at Passover tables for over 2,000 years, he has not been forgotten. He has been expected. And then something happened that the tradition, in all its careful preparation, had not entirely anticipated. A group of disciples were walking with Jesus when he asked them who people said he was. They gave various answers. Some say John the Baptist, they told him. Some say Elijah. Some say one of the prophets. Eli. The people watching Jesus thought he might be Elijah returned, the man from Gilead, the one who had been taken by the whirlwind, the one for whom the place at the table was kept. And then something happened on a mountain. Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter and James and John, and led them up a high mountain, and his face shone like the sun. His clothes became white as light, and 2 figures appeared beside him, Moses and Elijah. There they stood on the mountain in the light, the lawgiver and the prophet, the man of the burning bush and the man of the still small voice. The 2 who between them had carried the covenant across the most difficult centuries of Israel's history, standing together in the presence of the one who would fulfill everything both of them had ever said or done or suffered for. The disciples fell on their faces. When they lifted their heads, they saw no one but Jesus only. Moses and Elijah had come and gone. But the disciples had seen them. They had seen with their own eyes that the men who had walked with God in the most complete way the tradition had recorded were still present, still available to appear when the moment required it. Elijah was not gone. He was beyond what could be seen. Now look back over the whole arc of his life, and something becomes visible that was always there but only clear from here. He was prepared for that mountain. The drought did not waste him. The hiding at Cherith did not diminish him. The exhaustion at Jezreel and the despair under the broom tree and the isolation in the cave at Horeb were not detours from his purpose. They were the path to it. Every season of being emptied and refilled and sent out again was making him into the person who could stand in that light. The bread mattered. The ravens mattered. The widow's jar mattered. The thin, still voice mattered most of all. Now let us look at what he left behind, because the departure was not the end of the work. It was the beginning of its continuation in a form that did not require him. Elisha went on to walk faithfully through his own long ministry, performing acts of provision and healing and restoration that carried forward what Elijah had carried. The spirit of Elijah which Elisha had asked for at the Jordan proved sufficient for the work that followed. And even after Elisha himself died and was buried, the tradition records one final remarkable detail. A group of Israelites in the middle of burying a man were interrupted by a raiding band, and in haste threw the body into the tomb of Elisha. And when the body touched the bones of Elisha, the dead man came back to life and stood on his feet. Even the bones, even the physical remains of the man who had carried what Elijah carried. Even after death, life continued to pass through what had been faithful. The fire does not stop at the second half. In the Jewish tradition, Elijah is the expected one. The chair set at the table, the cup poured, the door opened into the night. He is the one for whom space is kept, because the tradition has never stopped believing that the one who was taken will return when the time is right. In the Islamic tradition, Elijah appears as Ilyas, a prophet sent to guide a people who had turned toward Baal. He calls them back. He is honored among the righteous. His story is the story of faithfulness to the one God in the face of what cannot answer. In the Christian tradition, beyond the mountain of light, Elijah stands as the pattern of the prophetic voice that prepares the way. John the Baptist is described in the language of Elijah wearing the same rough clothing, living in the same wilderness, carrying the same call to return before something greater arrives. The connection is not accidental. It is a signal that the Elijah pattern continues, that the work of the man from Gilead did not end with the chariot. Someone will always need to stand before the king and say what is true. Someone will always need to sit under the broom tree and confess that they have nothing. Left. Someone will always need to go to the cave at Horeb and wait for the thin, still voice that comes after the silence, after the fire. Someone will always need to pick up the cloak and walk back into the world. The mantle keeps falling, and every generation is asked whether it will pick it up. There is a question worth asking at the end of this long journey, and it is the honest question. Where did you recognize yourself in this story? Were you at Cherith in the season of hidden provision, when what is sustaining you is so small and so daily that you can barely call it a sign of anything? Or were you in Zarephath giving the last of what you have because a word came that you are trying to trust? Or were you on Carmel in the moment of greatest demand, when everything that has been building must be acted on now? Or were you under the broom tree? If you were under the broom tree, this whole story was written for you. Because the whole story of Elijah leads to the broom tree and then leads through it. The broom tree is not the end. It is the place where the bread is given, and the angel touches, and the thin, still voice comes, and the walking begins again. The journey is too great for you, but the bread is there, and the voice is there, and the mantle is waiting. You are not alone in the dark. You are not the last one holding what you are holding. There are 7,000 people you cannot see from inside your cave who are holding the same things you are holding in. The ways available to them in the places they occupy without the fire from heaven and without the public record. They are there. You are one of them, and the fire does not stop. Let us pray. Father, we have walked tonight through the life of a man who was made of the same material we are made of, who was afraid when the threat came in the morning, who sat under a desert tree and asked you to take his life, who heard the same question twice and gave the same honest answer both times. Thank you that you did not correct him. Thank you that you gave him bread. Thank you that the angel touched him not once but twice, because once was not enough. We are here tonight because we needed to hear this story. Some of us are at Cherith, sustained by provisions we cannot explain, waiting for something we cannot yet see. Some of us are in Zarephath, giving the last of what we have because someone spoke a word we are trying to trust. Psalm. Everyone has been on Carmel, and the fire fell, and now we are in the valley on the other side of the fire, trying to understand why the joy did not last longer. And some of us are under the broom tree. If you are under the broom tree tonight, hear this. The same God who sent the angel to the exhausted prophet in the desert knows exactly where you are. He knows the exact weight of what you are carrying. He knows how long you have been carrying it. He knows that the journey ahead is too great for you as you currently are. And he is not angry about that. He is baking bread. He will touch you. He may have already touched you tonight in the quiet of this story, in the moment when you recognized yourself in a man who lived 3,000 years ago and felt exactly what you are feeling now. Arise and eat, not because the journey is not hard. It is hard, not because you are not tired. You are tired. But because the bread is there, and the bread is enough. And on the other side of the eating is the walking. And on the other side of the walking is the thin, still voice. And on the other side of the voice is the field where the person who will carry what you cannot carry alone is already waiting. The mantle. E does not fall to the ground and stay there. Someone always picks it up. Lord, keep these who are listening tonight. Keep their going out and their coming in. Give them bread when they are under the broom tree. Give them the voice when they are in the cave. Give them the courage to throw the cloak over the shoulders of the person walking alongside them. And when the chariot comes, as it comes, for all of us in one form or another, let them go into it. Knowing that what they carried did not end with them, that the fire found its next hearth, that the mantle is still falling, and being picked up and falling again all the way across the centuries, all the way to this room, this night, this breath. Thank you for Elijah. Thank you for the bread. Thank you for the thin, still voice. And thank you that the darkness has not overcome the fire. Not once in 3,000 years, not tonight. Amen. Rest now. The broom tree is small, and the desert is wide, and the journey has been long. But you have heard tonight what Elijah heard in the cave, after the wind and the earthquake and the fire. Not a sermon, not an explanation, not a theological resolution to everything that has been hard. A voice, thin, still, quiet, speaking in this room, in this night, in the space between your breathing and the dark. You are known. You are not alone. You are held. The journey is too great for you. But you ate, and tomorrow you will walk.